Admiral Howard. It is the first time for her to be in Estonia. It's the first time for her to be at CyCon. But most importantly, she is the first female full four-star admiral in US Navy. Considers herself to be cyber warrior, not just naval commander, although she has done those things that every naval officer in this room is dreaming of commanding a task force. That is, I think, absolutely fantastic. Admiral Howard, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And I know we have a number of distinguished guests, so I want to say thank you for attending today and giving me a few minutes to share my perspective. So, how did I fall into cyber domain and becoming a cyber warrior? Well, in 2012, I had the honor of becoming a 3-star, and I was assigned as the number 2 at Fleet Forces Command. And the fleet, that fleet is a fantastic place. It has every type of asset the US Navy knows, from submarines to aircraft carriers, to explosive ordnance disposal technicians, to combat cameramen. It is literally 120,000 sailors. So it is a large organization with many moving parts, with the area that goes from the Arctic to the Caribbean to halfway across the Atlantic. Exercises and training and high-end warfare fighting. It became clear to me as the deputy commander that as active as we were in the sea domain, which for us was air and space and undersea, and moving sailors like combat engineers ashore, familiar with the land domain, we were not familiar with the cyber domain. So I put myself on this journey of really understanding the cyber domain and technology and what it means. And I'll be honest, in 2012, if you'd asked me about the cyber domain, I probably would have misspelled it with an S. That I was a novice to this. But through conversation and good warfighting dialogues, I came to some conclusions, and I used history as a metaphor and a way ahead of what I thought we needed to do, all of us as cyber warriors. And so I'd like to share with you my thoughts on leadership and technology change, because I think it's applicable to everyone, whether your uniform is a suit and tie or it looks something like this. First slide. So if you're going to talk about cyber, you got to go back a long time, because you got to go back to other leaders and other spaces and time. That picture of the guy in the uniform, that is Midshipman Chester Nimitz. Now, Chester Nimitz in World War II for the United States and arguably for the world was one of the great warriors in the Pacific. And he managed air campaigns that had never been done or seen before up into World War II. But this is him years and years before that. This is him at Annapolis as a student. And the world was very different. And then also, from another time frame, not much past that, the guy with the tie, that's Jan Turnesen, who was a leader in Estonia. And you see that picture, that's Estonia's Independence Day. And so what Chester Nimitz and Jan Turnesen have in common is they were born in the 19th century. They grew up in the 1800s. So when Chester Nimitz was a young man on a ranch, Jan Turnesen was in university here in Estonia. But when you look at the beginning of the 1900s, when Chester Nimitz is a midshipman, Jan Turnesen is a newspaper publisher, they're both seeing huge technological change. There's this, and social change. Jan is living through a time where politically the world is changing. There's a Bolshevik resolution, Estonia has declared their independence. He's a newspaper publisher, and he's trying to convince people that you can change the world through engagement and dialogue instead of through armed conflict, through insurgency. Nimitz, 1905, it's only been a couple of years since the flight of the Kitty Hawk. And this whole idea of aircraft doing anything else but just the magic of being in the air is well beyond what he's ever going to believe in. The Navy consists of large ships, battleships, and that's one that was built in 1904. And so, although they had seen great technology change. Since the 1800s, since they'd been born into the world was still very different for them. So for one reason, those photos are in black and white, is because color photography hadn't been invented. We're talking about a time frame for Chester Nimitz where there were no things like a crossword puzzle because it hadn't been invented. There were no things like toasters because they hadn't been invented. There's no Model T car because it hadn't been invented. When Chester Nimitz was a midshipman, the zipper had not been invented. That meant he had to learn how to use a zipper when he was an adult. And if you've ever caught your hand, you got to realize that's not something that's easy to learn to use. So the world was big and changing. But what's magnificent is these are leaders who adapted to the change. Next slide. So from a military perspective, for Chester Nimitz, this leader, he grows up into a world from 1905 up to World War II where the ships are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And for the navies of the world, we thought that's how we were going to fight. You'd have a lot of large ships. They would go out to sea and meet up with other large ships. You'd have long-reaching guns. Munitions would come out, and the fight would be on. So whoever had the biggest ships and the biggest guns would win. Oh, but then there was the flight of the Kitty Hawk. And by the beginning of World War I, aircraft were part of the military. Now, to start with, we were using aircraft as reconnaissance and surveillance. We'd send them up, and they would scout for where the enemy was. And even for my Navy, that's how we thought we would use aircraft. Our ships were big enough, we could flatten out the tops. Aircraft would fly out and look for other big ships. And they'd radio back, here's the enemy, and we would sail towards them. But then with the advent of World War I, this idea of an aircraft doing more than being a reconnaissance, a scout, came into being. There were visionaries like Billy Mitchell who said, you know, we not only can just see the enemy, we can attack the enemy. And this idea of dropping munitions out of aircraft, that came into being, aircraft fighting aircraft, and then the domain became part of the military battle space. And then that happened at sea as well. Now, someone like Billy Mitchell, at the end of World War I, he forcefully argued that the birth of a new domain had happened, and the old admirals and generals did not understand what was going on. And he was later court-martialed because he so forcefully and very negatively and publicly stated his views. But in the end, he was right. A whole new domain had happened. And so Chester Nimitz, who'd lived through World War I, by the 1920s, he's in the Naval War College, and he's studying the use of air power and how to implement it at sea. And so then by the time you get to World War II, and Chester Nimitz is in his 50s, he's now one of the deepest thinkers on the use of aircraft carriers and air power. And he and his fellow admirals, who are also born in the 1880s, because they'd embraced this technological change and thought about it and figured how to use it, they were able to dominate with aircraft carriers and air power at battles like Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. That is a remarkable, remarkable example. Someone who grew up without the existence of zippers wins a fight with something that had just been invented when he was about 22 years old. Next slide. So what does it say for us and the cyber domain and how we think about things? Well, there is this warfighting piece and this whole dimensional piece that Nimitz and everybody else had to wrap their minds around. And I think what's happened is the cyber has not only a new domain, it's actually created a new dimensionality to war that's challenging us. So when you look at when Jan Turnison and Chester Nimitz first started their professional lives, and for most military people, the world was really sort of one-dimensional. You had land, and you had armies, and life was as far as you could see or as far as your weapons could reach, but it was really in one plane. And then for those of us on the seas, it was the same sort of concept. As far as you could reach and far as you could see, but still within that one plane. Build. Well then for us, for the Navy, in World War I, there's the sinking of the Lusitania. And all of a sudden, we're in a two-dimensional war fight. We not only have to be worried about somebody who's in this plane I have to be worried about somebody who's beneath my feet. That changed the way we fought. It had to, because now you've got German U-boats you have to think about, as well as that battleship right in front of you. Build. So then we became three-dimensional warriors. So with air power, if you're at sea, you're not only worried about what's beneath your feet, what's right and left and fore and front, now you're worried about what's up above you. You're a three-dimensional war fighter in a short space of time, literally from World War I to World War II. So when you think about being a one-dimensional war fighter, we had thousands and thousands of years from the times of Phoenician and Roman legions to learn how to be one-dimensional war fighters. But in the space of 40 years, the US Navy and other navies had to figure out how to fight in 3 dimensions. So what is it about cyber? What's it doing to us? Well, my argument is that cyber has brought into our lives as military people the 4th dimension of warfighting. So let me take you on a journey and see if I can convince you. Now, some people say the 4th dimension, the key component is time. And I agree. In fact, there's some experts who said if we had named it correctly, we would have called it cyberspace time, not cyberspace. So let me ask a question. Has anybody in the audience ever read a children's book called A Wrinkle in Time? Yes. What was the book about? Ah! I read it. It had to do with time travel. Excellent answer. Please stand up. You always want to reward courage. Thank you. Time travel. It's this great book. And the theory is if you want to travel through time, you have to understand time itself. And so for those of us who are three-dimensional people, we think of time or travel in the dimensions we're in. We think the shortest way to get between point A to point B, from Naples to Estonia, is through a straight line, point A to point B. That's great. But if you're a time traveler, that's not the quickest way to travel. The quickest way to travel is to bring point A and point B together. You wrinkle time. You control time. Any physicist in the room, point A to point B together? Some people call it a tesseract. This is what the cyber domain's done. And all of us are time travelers, but we haven't absorbed it. Now, I will tell you, I did not come across this concept until I got my first computer, 1995. I'm buying my first computer, and some of you don't laugh, because let me remind you, the World Wide Web Consortium wasn't birthed till 1994. So I think I was pretty far ahead. So 1995, I get my first computer. It comes in a box. It gets to the house. I set it up, and gosh golly, it doesn't work. So I call the 1-800 number, and there's a gentleman from India who's going to help me fix my computer. And I'm in Kansas, United States. This was so long ago, he told me he was from India. So I'm sitting there in Kansas, and he's walking me through how to fix my computer. And then all of a sudden he says, I need to take control of your computer. And I'm thinking, this guy's in India. What the heck's he talking about? He goes, no, please, may I take control of your computer? And I said, yes. So I'm in Kansas, and all of a sudden the cursor on my computer starts to move. And in that moment, point A and point B met. India to Kansas, United States. I became a virtual time traveler. Physical activity from halfway around the world, and most amazing, at the speed of light. We were wrinkling time when we built the cyber domain. And although it consists of a lot of things in this dimension, fiber, hardware, computers, satellites up in space, we have now created the ability to have effects anywhere around the world at the speed of light. And so for a warfighter, that means we have to understand we not only have to fight in the 3 dimensions that we're used to, at the physical limits of what we've known. Simultaneously, we are going to have to be able to fight at the speed of light in this domain because it's everywhere. It's at sea, it's in the air. If any of you have ever used Wi-Fi on a plane, it's everywhere. Next slide. And then that's the hard part, isn't it? So when you look at the development of this domain, at the end of the parallel for air power, at the end of World War II going into the Korea War, that was what aircraft looked like. In 1982, I'm a midshipman, so I'm the 1982 version of the 1905 Chester Nimitz. And this was an F-14. It was the latest thing in air power, extremely powerful, probably 10 times more capable than what Chester Nimitz had. And aircraft carriers had grown exceedingly. In the computing world in the 1950s, that's what computers looked like, the witch computer, pieces of paper, tapes, fast computation. So then in 1982, when I graduated as a midshipman, that was the state of computing. That's a KComp 2. It's 29 pounds. It was $1,795, and I made $200 a month as a midshipman, so I didn't own one. And it could compute in possibly kilobytes per minute. And it was slick and fast. So for me, that was my zipper. Welcome to the new world. And the world kept changing. Next slide. So do we change with the world? In 1970, there's this book called Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. And his premise is that when technology changes so fast, we as human beings can't keep up. In 1970, he coins the phrase information overload. You have so much coming at you, technology change, information, that based on studies, you basically shut down. You can't absorb it anymore. It affects decision making. You come to a standstill. That's 1970, before the invention of the KComp 2, before the birth of the internet. He's talking about information overload. And it can happen to each of us as individuals. And I will tell you, I realized it was happening to me. So there's that computer that existed when I was a midshipman. Now, when I went off and graduated and went off on my first deployment, the state of banking looked like this. And for those of you who weren't around then, there were actual human beings that you talked to in an office building, and then this guy called the teller or gal called the teller. You gave them a piece of paper, and they gave you money, as long as you had money in your account. That's how we did banking. When I came back in 1986, the automated teller machine had taken over. And I couldn't believe it. Where was this person I needed to talk to? You're going to have a little plastic card. There's no way I was going to do that. I did not trust this machine. Well, it was business that drove it. Citicorp had started putting ATMs into New York City in the late 1970s. They were actually a dismal failure into a huge snowstorm in New York City. Meant everything shut down, and the people who had gone to ATMs still could get money, and the people who used to bank the way I banked could not. And then all of a sudden, ATMs proliferated throughout the United States. It was more efficient, it was ubiquitous, it was just easier. But for those of us who hadn't grown up with them, it was shocking. And then for some of the folks at the other end of the calendar, at the far end of the room, you're just laughing at me because you're like, banking by ATM, Admiral? There's an app for that. What? Who even uses a plastic card? I just take a picture. I do my banking on my phone. Absolutely. Absolutely. But as a leader, if we don't embrace this in our daily lives, and then we don't embrace it in our official lives, we will lose the next opportunity. For a warfighter, that means we might lose the war. For somebody who's a civilian, it might mean you might lose your business opportunity. So part of the example of Nimitz and Turnerson was their ability to not only observe change, but to embrace change, and then think about it and figure out how to make it to their advantage. Next slide. So when you talk about the addition of the cyber as this domain and dimension, it's pretty important to me as a warfighter that once I realize it is a domain, then I have to think about it as a domain. And this life, my former three-dimensional life, I could think about the war fight and whether or not I could be successful in the undersea, in the surface, in air and space. But now I have to think about the cyber and whether or not I can be successful in this domain simultaneously. But then when you think about it in that dimensional thought, you've got to consider, well, what if at some point, as a military person, I can only fight in one domain? What if it's so contested in that domain? How do I fight? And can I leverage the use of these domains? Next slide. So someday I might be in a fight where my enemy or adversary has ownership of that domain. And maybe where I'm least contested might be cyber or space. Well, that means as a warfighter, I've got to figure out how to manage that domain, manage that battle space, and fight from there. Next slide. And so maybe the only space I can dominate is space and cyber. And I will have to fight from that domain into the physical domains, air, land, and surface, in order to dominate. Next slide. So we have no problems thinking about this in the physical world. I, as a naval warfare officer, I can dominate the land from the sea. I can shoot missiles from the sea. Somebody from land can fly an aircraft over me and drop bombs on my ship. And we're very used to and thinking about fighting integrated in these domains. A submarine underneath the ocean can attack another submarine, or it can shoot and attack land. We are going to have to think about the same thing from cyber. And then the other piece is we have defensive capabilities in all of these domains. We have to have defensive capability in both space and in cyber. Next slide. So if these domains are real, then what does it mean for warfighting and this whole idea of anti-access aerial denial? Well, anti-access is purely the blockading of a means, a way for you to get into a theater. And then aerial denial is once you're in that theater, you can't maneuver because the space is contested. It's being held by someone else. One of the classic cases, not in wartime, was in 2012, Iran threatened to mine the Straits of Hormuz. That would have meant anybody, merchant traffic, military, anybody, anti-access. We would not have been able to get into the Arabian Gulf. And then if they actually had put out mines, it would have made it hard to operate in the Arabian Gulf. It would have been anti-access and area denial. And so in response, the nations of the world got together and they started to do demonstrations, mine warfare demonstrations, so that at its peak, we're talking there were 41 different navies doing demonstrations to say, no, this is important, this is international waters, and we are here to help keep it free. And so when you have anti-access area denial, if you're not at war, you can do demonstrations. If you are at war, then you have to be ready to fight in this 3 dimensions. But what does it mean for cyber? Next slide. 2012 was also the year that Aramco was attacked. They are one of the largest OPEC-producing companies in the world. In one day, 30,000 computers were taken down. They were still able to produce and manage and move oil, probably due to the persistence and talent of all of their employees. But 30,000 computers taken down, emails lost, PST files destroyed. Arguably, any other organization that had that much done to it in a single day, would it be able to operate? And when I talk to my sailors, I use this as an example, because I'll say, you know, in a carrier strike group, how many computers do you think there are? And if all those computers were taken down in a single hour, would we still be able to arm aircraft? Would we still be able to launch aircraft? Would we still be able to communicate back to shore? Would I be able to command and control? And if we are that reliant on these systems, then we have to be able to defend our networks. to make sure that we can do the things we've been trained to do. So this is at a single organization, and I make the application to a single tactical situation, a single carrier strike group. But what happens when it's bigger than that? Next slide. I think when it's bigger than that, it's what happened here in Estonia, 2007. Now we're talking an unbelievable distributed denial of service, where you have an attacker who creates a botnet, who enslaves thousands, probably thousands of machines, and takes down, the finances, the government, and over a series of weeks, denies access to the internet, anti-access to the internet for the people and the government of Estonia. And it's interesting. As a military person, when I look at thousands of machines creating signals to take down websites, I think of that in military terms, volume of fires. And I also think about, where's our law today? Because if you had a car parked outside a store and someone took it, you'd say, that's thievery. And yet, someone can take control of your computer without your consent and use it. And we don't call it theft. And so, whatever lens you look through this, there's applications. And there's a need for us to have a good dialogue on what this means in military terms, what it means in legal terms, what it means in international law of armed conflict terms. And I think that is the whole purpose of the Center of Excellence, coming to cohesiveness and consistency in how we see this domain and what it means to us, all of us. And so the other thing about this domain is we're all in it. Children, playing, people, innovators, business people, criminals, all of us, military, we're all in this domain. And so whether we want to be or not, we all end up being cyber warriors. And so if you would protect yourself from criminal activity in the three-dimensional world you grew up in, you should be protecting yourself in this domain. And if you know how to fight in the three-dimensional world you grew up in, you have to know how to protect yourself and fight in this domain. Last slide. So I don't know what that means for the future of the military, what we're going to look like, and who's going to be the cyber warrior. But I suspect it's going to be a blend of both these people, that it's not one or the other, but that we all are responsible for understanding how to defend ourselves, protect our nations, and how to operate in this domain. That as leaders, we owe ourselves thinking about the example of someone like Chester Nimitz, a guy who had to learn how to use a toaster when he was an adult, to winning a campaign in the Pacific. A woman who had to figure out how to use an automatic teller machine to figure out how to lead 120,000 sailors to win and fight in this domain. We all owe ourselves that opportunity. So thank you for listening to me today, and with that, I'll take questions.
I can hold it for a second. So questions for our Admiral. We have about 4 minutes, 2 questions. I would abuse my position and actually ask the first one, Admiral.
Yes.
What is in your work, career experience, and when you are trying to prepare us all for the future, what is the biggest challenge? Is it in people's minds? Is it a legacy thinking, legacy system? Basically, where is the bottleneck?
So I think you've hit across one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we have. It's the people, our individual people, whether they work for us in a business or they work for me on a ship, and their understanding of what their activities mean. And what I found is I have to create illustrations for my sailors so they understand that what they're doing can have a warfighting impact. So here's one of the stories I use. Has anybody in here ever seen a submarine movie? Okay. So just about, I think they all use the same script. There's 2 submarines. There's always the good guy and the bad guy, and then they're waiting towards the bottom of the ocean, and they're just listening for each other, because whoever makes the noise first, the game is on, and they're going to have the advantage on the other submarine, and that's where he is, and I'm going to find him. So they're just waiting there. And then what happens when they're both waiting there? It's the same thing in every submarine movie. Anyone? Somebody drops a wrench. Who said that? Stand up and be recognized. Absolutely. Thank you so much. So somebody drops a wrench. And it's always the guy you like. It's never the sonar tech because he's a professional. It's like the cook. Oh, and he's, no. And so everybody on both submarines are at battle stations just trying to go after each other. So when you think about the internet and who we are, I tell my sailors, when you have a video gaming console and you plug it into the ship's internet system, you have just dropped the wrench. And they go, oh yeah. So that access, you've created an access point where someone can get into our systems. You could be beaconing. We have got to come up with more and more metaphors for people who trust this domain because they grew up in it or grew up in the physical domain to help them understand what the warfighting effect is or what the business effect is. That's where we owe our good thinking. And then once we tell them what it means, they already know what to do. Yes?
Ma'am, what steps have you taken, what mindset have you had that has kept you relevant in your career as well as cyber?
Playing. So let me ask you this question. How many of you, audience participation, how many of you own a gaming console? At least two. Raise your hand. There are yours. Do you play with them? Put your hand down. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. So everybody else, please look around. And if you don't own a gaming console, look at how few people in the room do. Thank you very much. The average American family right now has four. When I did a survey, as I walked around both as deputy commander as vice chief, I would ask this question. I've asked this question of thousands of sailors and civilians. My average sailor owns 10. 10. Now, the Navy is a little bit unique. We're a young organization, and 85% of my sailors are millennials, the enlisted, and 60% of my officers are millennials. They don't even know life without a video game. But if you're an adult and you have children and you're not playing the video games with them, you don't understand the life or the world or the power of the internet. Because our sailors then, our family members can be vulnerable because they could be playing with somebody they think is in their club. They could be playing somebody from China for all I know. But if we don't embrace the technology and learn to use it ourselves, that's the biggest challenge. For the Navy, when we were trying to decide how to train admirals, the men who were in their 50s, we started to send them to flight school in their 50s, that they could become familiar with the technology before they would have to be, as leaders, directive on how to employ it. What I'm missing right now is my cyber pilot school for folks who didn't grow up with the technology, a way to train people that's fun, that allows them to understand the power of the internet, the innovation of the internet, and the possibilities of the internet. So that was a great question to end on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Admiral. And something for you to enjoy with your next video game, some chocolates. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.